We are out for an adventure today. I'm going to try and put together my inflatable kayak, and then we are going to go visit a historic structure here in the South Puget Sound. We're going to visit a building that's been standing since the mid-1800s and was one of the first settlements here in the South Puget Sound. And it revolutionized the way for countless industries that are still standing today. And that building is in jeopardy. So we're going to go take a look at it, talk about its past, its present, and what are its future plans. But before we do that, I need to see if I can remember how to put this kayak together, because I only use it maybe twice a year. Bear with me. Okay, so that was a little more cardio than I was prepared for. And shame on me. When I unrolled this, I realized that I hadn't actually cleaned it since the last time that I used the boat, which was the end of summer. So about 3-4 months ago. Shame on me. It's a little salty on the bottom because I had it out in a saltwater bay then also. So I have to remember when I'm done today and get home to roll this back out in the yard, spray it down to get all the salt off. But if you're wondering, this is the Itiwit 3. It's a 3-man inflatable kayak. I picked it up from Decathlon, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 years ago. It is something I paid full price for, and no, this is not a sponsored video, and I don't have a discount code for it. Sorry. But I love this inflatable kayak. The only thing I would probably change is I would love to maybe someday get a smaller 1-man kayak that's a little bit easier to throw on my back and, you know, go do a hike and then head out on an adventure. This thing on its own weighs, with the pump and the bag and the 3 seats and paddles, probably between 35 and 40 pounds. So it's not super ultra lightweight, but it does all fit into that bag that I carried it in on. So you can carry it down to the beach like what I did today. But it's certainly not lightweight. Anyways, let's get this adventure started. So we are in the middle of the South Puget Sound in Washington State. This is one of the inside passages of Case Inlet. If you're not familiar with the Puget Sound, Washington State is made up of a series of fingers that come out from the mainland on the west side of the northern part of the state. And Puget Sound is what eventually connects Washington to the open ocean and international shipping and trade and commerce. We rely heavily on our ports and our waterways, not only for trade and commerce, but also recreation. And then you have this amazing place of the South Puget Sound, which is very little traveled, believe it or not. There's just not a lot of boat traffic that comes down here because there isn't a lot of access to fuel docks or supplies. So if you're not a sailor, then there's not a whole lot for you down here, just because you're going to run out of fuel and you're going to have to find another way around. We are just coming into Mayo Cove, which is this beautiful little cove just off Case Inlet. And it's where the town of Lakebay started. Now, when I say town, take that with a grain of salt. Lakebay does not have a general store. It does not have a post office. Doesn't have an elementary school anymore, but it does still have 3 churches. Now, Lakebay was originally settled in, so it's 1872, 73. I'll put that up on the notes if I'm wrong. But it was named for a little lake that's about a half a mile from the mouth of the bay. But Lakebay wasn't really much more than a homestead until the lumber industry came to town. And that's where our story is going to begin. So in 1882, a German immigrant by the name of Karl Lenz came to town. And he opened up the first lumber mill here in the Peninsula, which is this area of the South Puget Sound. Well, by 1884, Karl realized that if he was going to get his timber to Tacoma, the closest port for sale, he was going to have to move it himself. So he opened up his own fleet of steamer ships and barges that he utilized to get the timber out of here, which meant he needed to build a marina or at least a port. So in 1884, Karl put in the first piers here in Lakebay and started the first Mosquito Fleet in the South Puget Sound. I'm gonna get blown out to sea. It's the only drawback to this large of an inflatable is it's so prone to the wind that it's kind of taking everything I've got just to get into the bay here. I'm gonna see if I can get over to the building, maybe tuck up against a piling, and then we'll finish this tale. Let a barnacle pier hold this in place. Yeah, that wind is pretty intense when you're in a giant inflatable boat. So anyways, back in 1884, the first pilings were put in to this structure here, right? It was designed to be a port in order to float the logs, hook the barges up and the steamers, and then push the logs all the way into Tacoma where they could be sold. Well, Karl rapidly realized that he could actually make more money hauling people and freight than he could his own lumber. So in the early 1900s, Karl shut down his lumber mill and actually doubled down on the Mosquito Fleet principle of his business. He extended the dock here, put in more structures, then started to run a pretty impressive trade in transporting people and goods from dock to dock in some of these isolated settlements. Now, if you're not familiar with what a Mosquito Fleet is, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there weren't any roads or infrastructure around here. So these boats acted as a ferry system and connected these isolated communities and allowed the expansion to happen here in Washington. The Mosquito Fleets are a whole other story, and we can go into a lot of detail on that. If you folks are interested, just let me know. But the Mosquito Fleets ran until probably the early 1930s, 1940s, and then the infrastructure of roads and highways became so vast that there wasn't really an economical need for the boats anymore. So anyways, back to Lakebay. By the late 1920s, this community was very well established, but the timber industry had kind of ground to a halt. And it was time to shift gears completely with this property. And it was actually handed over to the Washington State Poultry and Egg Cooperative, which was founded right here in Lakebay. Now, this egg and poultry cooperative actually shipped eggs all around the world and helped support the war effort. But in 1958, the Egg Co-op merged with another farmers cooperative in Gig Harbor, a neighboring community with better port access and more community support. So the co-op shut down, and this place kind of just dwindled to nothing. So it sat empty for a few years until in the early 1960s, it was picked up by a local investor who wanted to turn this into a recreational resort. And that's kind of the cool part about Lake Bay. And that's what I remember from growing up in this area. Not in the 60s, but when I was a kid, you could come down here, and I remember some of my earliest memories of this facility, right? The building that we're underneath now, that used to be the Egg Co-op, where they would process the eggs for shipping, was actually a mini mart grocery store over the water. There was a fuel dock here for pleasure crafts to pull in, fill up their boats. We could come up here and get an ice cream cone and some snacks before you headed out on the rest of your adventure. But unfortunately, the South Puget Sound is not a heavily trafficked area, and it was really hard to sustain and bring in enough profit to keep the building up. And due to some safety restrictions, the building was always shut down for repairs and then would reopen, and a couple of the structures were required to be torn down just because they were unsafe. Eventually, the state came in and required the owners to remove the docks just because it was unsafe for boats to come in and tie up, and they didn't want anybody wandering around the facility. And the place has just kind of sat vacant ever since. And it's sad because this facility was a pretty amazing place. But there is hope for this whole building, because in 2019, this facility, the Lakebay Marina building, was actually recognized in the historic register, which means it is now going to be preserved because it is a historic structure, which means it cannot be torn down. And in 2021, the property was actually gifted to the Department of Natural Resources. So this is now a DNR property, and they actually have a plan to redevelop this facility under the ownership and guidance of the Department of Natural Resources, which means there is hope yet of someday getting the fuel dock reestablished, getting the marina back in place for the pleasure crafts, and maybe someday getting an ice cream cone above me. Ooh, that's not good. That looks like an old septic pipe. Don't want to get stuck under that when it's leaking. So you'll notice that the old dock, this was the pier that was used to tie back to the dock for the barges. It is in still fantastic condition. Just the rest of the facility has really been let to just fall apart over the years. But I remember as a kid coming here, you had the opportunity to get out into the park, stretch your legs, run around and play and scream like wild kids. Kept our grandparents from killing us when they were on the boat with us for too many days in a row. And hopefully someday this place will be fully restored, and I'll be able to bring my son down here and share some of the same experiences with him. I was hoping to be able to find a place to go ashore here, but with the tide being as high as it is, there is no beach, and I've got a pontoon that's getting real squishy. So I either didn't get the outlet sealed well enough, or when I was dragging across rocks earlier trying to get across the sandbar, I might have punctured it, but I don't know. So I'm gonna paddle like a maniac over to the state park before I start sinking, and we'll see what's going on. See you guys in just a minute. don't see any signs of a puncture. That's good news. I'm guessing I just didn't get the cap on straight. So the beauty of an inflatable is I've got the pump with me and I can just fill it back up again. Graceful. The nice thing about the breeze and the outgoing tide is we're going to make great time getting back around the bay. As long as I don't miss our turn and get pulled out to sea. So next up on the agenda, we've got a little beach on the backside of Penrose here. It's called East Beach. Overlooks McNeil Island, which is a prison island. It's a beautiful island, but it's a prison. But we're gonna set up camp over there, fire up the barbecue, and get some salmon growing. And if you want to see that one, well folks, you'll need to tune in next week for that. So until then, I hope you have an amazing time out there on the trail, whether it's via land or water. Get outside, do a little bit of exploring, and just have an all-around amazing adventure. We'll see you next time.